When I watch you, wrapped up like garbage, sitting surrounded by the smell of two old potato peels. Or when I watch you in your old man shoes with the little toe cut out, sitting, waiting for your mind like next week's grocery. I say when I watch you, you wet brown bag of a woman who used to be the best looking gal in Georgia, used to be called the Georgia Rose, I stand up through your destruction. I stand up. This is a poem called Miss Rosie by Lucille Clifton. And with any poem, it's always good to read the poem out loud and to kind of pay attention to what's going on with the literal aspects of the poem before you start digging for any deep, dark, figurative meanings. And it's good to read a poem several times over and rather let things start to emerge and start to think about what you see just by reading the poem. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at it again with Miss Rosie. So one of the first things you want to do with the poem is to think about the title, Miss Rosie. All right. So the subject of the poem is a woman named Miss Rosie. Another thing you want to think about is the speaker of the poem or the I of the poem. And so we have this. We have the word "I" mentioned several times throughout this poem, and you may notice that each stanza begins with "When I watch you," "When I watch you," and then again the third stanza, "When I watch you," and then there's "I stand up," "I stand up." There's a lot of "I" going on in this poem. So it seems like the speaker is a pretty important part of this poem, and the speaker's perception of what's going on with Miss Rosie is pretty important. So I don't know, when I read this poem and I see "when I watch you" repeated over and over and over, I think that's pretty important. Generally in poetry, anything that is repeated several times or at least more than once is going to be pretty important. So we want to pay particular attention to those things. In this case, "when I watch you" is repeated at regular intervals, and so it's almost like the chorus in a song. It gives the poem unity. It's repeated regularly, and it's kind of the focusing point of the poem. "When I watch you." So we may come back to that in a little bit. Let's take a look at the imagery also. Wrapped up like garbage, sitting surrounded by the smell of two old potato peels. I've often heard that poetry is beautiful language set to verse, but there's nothing beautiful about this language. It's some pretty disturbing, pretty disgusting imagery, and these are similes. When I watch you wrapped up like garbage. Not a very flattering thing to say about a woman, but it is, the speaker, I think, is just being truthful. Wrapped up like garbage, sitting around by the smell of two old potato peels. And so when we discuss imagery, we're not just discussing the visual imagery, not just the sizes and shapes and colors of things, but also we have other senses that imagery appeals to also, like the sense of smell. So in this case, we have the smell of two old potato peels. And with imagery, we want to pay attention to all five of the senses: sight, smell, sound, taste, and touch. And when I watch you in your old man shoes with a little toe cut out, sitting, waiting for your mind like next week's grocery. I don't know about you, but I think it's safe to infer that Miss Rosie, based on the imagery, could be homeless. I would say there's a lot of evidence to support that. Homeless people are often found, unfortunately, in places where there are garbage cans or dumpsters, in back alleys, because unfortunately that's where sometimes people who are down on their luck can find their only meals. So she's wrapped up like garbage. She's sitting, and in the second stanza, she's also sitting. We see Miss Rosie dressed in old man shoes with a hole in the shoes. So she's probably just wearing whatever she can find. And the other thing I think that really emphasizes the aspect of this poem, or the case that Miss Rosie is probably homeless, is this line, she's waiting for her mind like next week's grocery. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that kind of goes hand in hand with homelessness is mental illness, and we know for a fact that mental illness is a major component or a major cause of homelessness. And so the fact that Rosie's waiting for her mind, you can almost see a kind of a vacant look in her eyes, and really just kind of living in a different reality than what's going on physically. And she's waiting for her mind like next week's grocery. And we can assume from that Miss Rosie, probably doesn't know where her next meal's coming from, which also contributes to the idea that she's perhaps homeless. And so the third stanza says, "When I watch you, you wet brown bag of a woman." And again, more garbage and imagery. Back in the old days before they had plastic garbage bags, people used to use the paper grocery bags to wrap their garbage up in. And of course, when you put wet garbage into a paper grocery bag, it's going to soak through and it's going to get really pretty nasty looking. And I think also in this line, we want to notice, the words between the stanzas. The first one's just kind of a matter of fact. When I watch you, and then or when I watch you. But this one, I think, I say, sounds like it's being used for emphasis. I say. So, when people say this, it kind of sounds like, hey, I want you to pay attention. Listen to the words I'm saying. When I watch you, you wet brown bag of a woman. So the tone becomes a little more intense here, a lot more emphasis. Right before we hit this part of the poem, which is, I think, a really good example of irony. And so far up to this line, all we have is Miss Rosie and a lot of negative imagery, a lot of sad imagery, and then used to be the best looking gal in Georgia. And wow, that sort of comes by surprise. Used to be called the Georgia Rose. So I don't know, I think this really captures that feeling that when we see homeless people or we see people who are down on their luck, it's very tempting for us to assume that these people have always been this way. Or sometimes, unfortunately, we do hear a lot of judgmental language being used towards homeless people saying, well, just get a job, just take care of yourself. People are homeless because they're lazy, when in fact we know that a lot of times people are homeless for a lot of different reasons, and that homeless people are usually victims of sometimes their own bad choices, but also of lots of other circumstances that are beyond their control. So we have Miss Rosie, who used to be the best looking gal in Georgia, used to be called the Georgia Rose. So I think that kind of brings to mind that people who are down on their luck were not necessarily always down on their luck. That was somebody's child at some point. At some point, these people very often did have productive lives, and they weren't always in such dire circumstances. So used to be the best looking gal in Georgia, used to be called the Georgia Rose. Now, I tend to think that, if Miss Rosie had done anything else with her life, we probably would know about it here. But the only thing we have to go on, the only thing about Miss Rosie's past is that she used to be the best looking gal in Georgia and used to have this nickname, the Georgia Rose. So I don't know, I tend to think that if Miss Rosie had had a career, or if she had had children, a family, if she'd had anything other than just her appearance, it probably would appear here. So I think this is probably a case of our paying attention to what's not there, and what's sort of conspicuously absent from the poem, which kind of tells me that perhaps Miss Rosie maybe thought a lot about her own looks, but just didn't do much else. And we know for a fact that looks fade. Youthful beauty is going to go away, no matter who you are, or no matter how beautiful a person is. That youthful appearance is going to go away. And, I guess we should have a plan B or, something else to fall back on. But it kind of seems to me anyway that Miss Rosie has put a lot of stock into her appearance, but maybe not into much else. And the end of a poem is almost always really important because it can often change the way we perceive lots of other things that go on in the poem. So I always say that it's like the closing arguments in a court case. It's the last thing you see before you make your final judgment or interpretation of the poem. And so Lucille Clifton, the author, chooses to end this poem with these lines: "I stand up. Through your destruction, I stand up." Now, stand up is a little bit ambiguous. Literally, standing up could be just, getting up on your feet. But, stand up can mean a lot of things. It can mean to rise above something. It can mean to come out victorious. And this, I don't know, this is kind of open to a lot of interpretations. And I've heard some people say that "I stand up through your destruction" sounds a little mean-spirited. It sounds like maybe this person is standing up to because they see Miss Rosie self-destructing, and they're glad to see Miss Rosie self-destructing. And that's a fair interpretation, but based on the rest of the tone of the poem, I think there's probably something more going on here. "I stand up through your destruction, I stand up," and of course that's repeated again, so we know it's there for emphasis. Seems to me that maybe this person is observing Miss Rosie and watching her destroy herself or go through this period of self-destruction, and maybe seeing her as a negative role model and learning from Miss Rosie's mistakes. So "I stand up through your destruction, I stand up" kind of says to me that maybe the speaker of this poem is perhaps also a beautiful woman who could have maybe relied on her looks perhaps too much. And by watching what Miss Rosie has done and what she's not done, this person sees her as a negative role model and says, well, thank goodness I've been able to see what Miss Rosie has done, and I'm able to learn from that and maybe have a plan B, maybe not just put all of the emphasis on appearance, and maybe do something else and have another part of my identity besides just being a good-looking person and getting lots of attention that way. And being sort of a multifaceted personality. So I see the repetition of "when I watch you" kind of indicates to me that the speaker sees Miss Rosie on a regular basis. And I always like to imagine this person being a female who walks out of her apartment every morning on her way to work. And just for me, I tend to view this as an urban situation, in a city where this woman is walking out of her apartment and walking a few blocks down to the bus station or the train station to make her way to work, and passing Miss Rosie every morning on the way to work, passing Miss Rosie every morning or every evening on the way back home from work, and seeing Miss Rosie and having being affected by seeing Miss Rosie's destruction. I watch you, I watch you, I watch you. And because I've seen you, go through this period of destruction, I'll know not to do the kinds of things that perhaps you've done. And we don't know exactly what Miss Rosie has done. We're not told the story of what happened between when Miss Rosie was the best looking gal in Georgia and the time she ends up in this horrible condition that we see her in now. I stand up through your destruction. I stand up. So, and I think this is, thematically a universal truth is that we can all do this. We can, I think it's a natural tendency to look at people who have made some bad decisions or have maybe not had a lot of foresight and, to use them as regular role models or negative role models. And to avoid the situations they've been in. We can do that through literature also. We can read things like Romeo and Juliet that, show what not to do, and we can learn from those. One last thing I want to say about this is that, the author chooses to call this person Miss Rosie. And, word choice is always important, and particularly in poetry. The diction that an author chooses to use invokes lots of connotations. And so I don't think Lucille Clifton chose to call her main character Miss Rosie by accident or just by, some random selection of a name. Roses, as we know, are often symbols for lots of different things. They can be symbols for love. They can be symbols for death. They can be symbols for beauty. And in this case, I think Lucille Clifton is using the rose as a symbol for not just beauty, but the transient nature of beauty. The fact that beauty very often doesn't last very long. It's kind of like a rose. It's beautiful, very beautiful for a short period of time until it begins to wilt and wither away, and then just kind of crumble into whatever plant is left after the rose has finally faded away. And I think, people are kind of like that too. The beauty of a human being, the beauty of anything is usually very short-lived. And so in this case, Miss Rosie is a little bit like a rose. Her, she had this sort of flash in the pan kind of beauty, this moment of glory. And then as it starts to fade away, she doesn't really have anything to fall back on. And now we have this sort of a shell of a human being that Miss Rosie is left being. And of course, the speaker learning from that, standing up through destruction. The structure of the poem is worth noting. This is a free verse poem, and free verse poems do not have a rhyme scheme. They don't have a metrical pattern or meter. And this is a free verse poem. We don't have a regular number of syllables in each line. We don't have a regular metrical pattern or rhythm that goes on in the poem. So it is a free verse poem. But it does have a lot of other poetic elements, like the refrain, like the symbol of the rose, like the imagery that we see, and of course the irony that we see here when we're kind of hit with this notion that Rosie used to be the best looking gal in Georgia. So that should cover most of the important things having to do with Miss Rosie. I'm sure there are lots of other interpretations and ideas you could come up with this poem, but that's where we are for now. That's Miss Rosie by Lucille Clifton.